was a joy to read the document. I really appreciated the chance to read the Advancing Scotland as a Learning Society. I liked sheer commitment to lifelong learning and to the idea of a learning society, because I share that. You know, when I was thinking about this talk, about my own trajectory as someone who has done a lot of different things in life, but I think the thing that kind of unites that is really a passion about learning. I mean, when I joined the BBC many years ago as a researcher in current affairs, I kind of thought it was an extension of my adult education role. I wasn't right about that, but that was one of the reasons why I was very keen to go into the media. I was a trainer, as a writer, even in setting up the centre, a lot of what we are doing is education in a way. So I am very, very passionate about this. I also did work briefly for the WEA, and I see Joyce here, at one point in Edinburgh, and I did various jobs for the WEA, and I'm very, very passionate, particularly about the idea of ordinary working people becoming turned on to education and personal development. I mean, when I wrote Materials that Made the Clyde book, the part which was about the ILP and, you know, the Maxton and these socialist Sunday clubs and cycling clubs and the everlasting fire, that was what inspired me. That was the great time, I think, in Glasgow's history for me. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I like the urgency in the paper, I like the big vision, and I like the willingness to engage with some of the difficult challenges that Scotland has around this agenda. I think that there was a freshness in saying, look, there are some substantial challenges. Now, I could come and say today what I think they are, because, you know, if I look at my book, The Scots Crisis of Confidence, what I'm really hoping for is more learning and more openness to change, because I think that a lot of Scots are stuck, that there's too much of a fear of what other people think. I think there's a great fear of getting it wrong, which I think can be quite stultifying for people. But I think a lot of you will have heard me talk on that, and I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about something that's a new and developing area of work for the centre that I think is, in many ways, the great elephant in the room, and I think it permeates the paper, but it's never really greatly named. And what I want to talk about is the materialist values that have completely come to dominate our world and are a major problem, I think, for us if we're trying to realise the vision that you have in that paper. Now, what am I meaning by materialist values? Well, I'm using the work of a man called Tim Kasser, who's a professor of psychology at Knox College in Illinois. We had him over in Scotland recently. He also did a webinar for us. And then he's written a book called The High Price of Materialism. He's done a lot of research himself, but he's also looked at a lot of the research that's been done on materialism and materialist values. And he defines materialism as money and what it can buy, appearance and image, and fame, popularity, and status. These are what he says makes up materialist values. Now, if you think about them, they are values that are always going to be around for human beings. They're always going to be motivating for human beings, because money is about having a roof over your head. It's about being able to put food on your table. It's about, you know, buying clothes, whatever it might be. That matters, and it will always matter for people. Equally, it's going to matter what you look like. That's about sexual attractiveness. It's about how we're seen by other people. It's about social acceptability. That's always going to matter, and we know that it always has mattered. I mean, that's what archaeologists have shown, you know, digging up things from, you know, cave dwellers or whatever. They wore ornament. We are going to, you know, care about what we look like. And equally, status, popularity, these kind of things will always be important for people, because we are such social animals. And if I look back on, you know, growing up in Scotland in the 50s and 60s, going to university at the late 60s, these values were around. Of course we cared about these things, but they did not dominate our lives, right? That is what has changed, because we are now living in a world where these materialist values are completely swamping what people now think is the pursuit of a good life. That is what's happened. It has now become incredibly dominant, and it is really, really bad for people, because if you look at the research that's been done by Kasser and others, what it shows is the more people pursue these values in life, the worse their well-being is. And the very simple explanation is, it's because it takes you away from the things that really do matter for a good life, which is relationships, it's community, it's a sense of challenge, it's about development, it's spirituality, it's, you know, being in contact with nature. These are the things that give people quality of life. But the more that you think it's just about money, appearance, status, image, whatever, then the less likely you are to realize the things that really make a difference to us. And what we've got is, I think, a very, very ugly situation that has come to pass, that people are so dominated by materialist values, that's how they're living their lives. So a lot of the time, why people want the latest phone is not because of what the latest phone can do, it's how you're seen through the eyes of other people. So that is a fundamental part of materialism. It's so much through the eyes of other people. One report that came out recently, which really reinforced this, is a report by UNICEF written by a woman called Dr. Agnes Nairn, who's actually a Scot, but she's a professor of marketing at some French universities. And she's written this recent report for UNICEF to try and help account for why British youngsters scored lowest in all the OECD countries for well-being. Remember that came out a wee while ago, 20 countries. Britain was bottom, actually would have been second bottom because some of the American data wasn't there, but we will not fight over first or, you know, who's bottom or second bottom. And what Agnes Nairn did was she went on and she looked at Britain and compared it with Spain and Sweden. Sweden scores very high for child well-being, Spain less so, but is still in the top 10. And what she's looking at is materialism and inequality, and Britain is a much, much more unequal society than those two, and I'm going to come back to that. But more importantly, what came out in that research is a picture of youngsters generally wanting the same thing across the three countries. What the kids were looking for was time spent with family and friends, being outdoors and doing interesting things. That's what they wanted. Apart from the poor kids in Britain who had a much more materialist philosophy of life, who thought about stuff, being on their PlayStations, getting, you know, clothes bought for them, that's how they defined it. But the major shock in many ways in this study is the fact that British parents were very different from the Spanish and the Swedish parents because they saw their role as providing stuff for their children. They thought that it was by buying brands, it was about stopping their kids being bullied or being excluded in some way. And a lot of the time, they just didn't have the time and the energy because they were working long hours and they're not at home a lot. And the idea of the kids sitting up in the media bedsit with all that paraphernalia is a particularly British phenomenon in terms of Europe. It's probably very common in America as well. But this was not a picture that the Spanish or the Swedish or I think other European countries would recognize. Now, this is a really important thing that is happening, and I don't think that there is enough attention paid to it. It's actually people who have the least resources who are now spending them on things that are very much about appearance, image, status, how you're seen through the eyes of other people. Now, this has got a huge consequence for learning as well. And I've been picking this up for the last few years, not just in Britain, but also in Europe as well. Let me give you a Scottish example, and it was a guy in Fife who was working with young people. And he said, he was doing football classes, and he said, 10 years ago, the young lads would have come in if we were running a summer school in football skills, and they would just want to kick the ball about, and if they learned something, fine. He said, now they come in and they're hanging back, hands in their pocket, terrified to kick the ball in case they kick a duff shot. In other words, they are more concerned about what psychologists call social evaluative threat. how they are seen through the eyes of other people, that it's impeding the learning process. Now, that is what more and more teachers are saying as well, that it's very, very common now for people to be overly concerned about failure and mistakes. In fact, there was a thing in the paper recently from one of the fee-paying girls' schools that's got a failure week because they are recognising that these girls are terrified of failure, and it's something that I've also picked up. So some of the top schools have got a lot of the problems of this type as well, a rigidity around this. And I think a lot of this is about self-esteem. It's about far too much emphasis on how you are seen through the eyes of other people. Now, I've said that there are individual costs to the pursuit of these values. What I think is even more worrying in many ways is the collective costs of the pursuit of these values. And one of them is inequality. Britain has become a deeply unequal society. I had the pleasure to speak in the same platform as Danny Dorling, who's a social geographer, last year at the I Write Book Festival. And he put it really, really starkly. He said from 1919 until 1979, there was almost a year-on-year improvement in income inequality. You know, if you look at it in terms of, you know, how much of income does the top 1% earn, you can see in his graph that it kind of went like that, came right down. In 79, it starts to come back up again, right? We're now back at levels of inequality in Britain that applied in 1854 when Dickens was writing Hard Times. Of course, we don't have the same poverty, because poverty is relative, but in terms of inequality, that is how steep the problem now is in Britain. And I think people feel that. If I think about my experience growing up from a working class household in the 1960s, it was qualitatively different, I think, because you felt that there was a steady improvement. If we look at the Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, and what they're presenting is the evidence that says that unequal societies have much worse outcomes in terms of health, social problems, and so on, that I think you can then look at a lot of what's happening in Britain with this deep inequality and say, this is partly why we have got such levels of social dysfunction that is costing us an awful lot of money to try and address, because we are actually have people living lives that are not good lives and that do not generate good well-being. If you look at the other things, the collective challenges of the materialist agenda, it's corporate greed and the bonus culture. I mean, I am absolutely amazed in many ways at the debate that we're having on bonuses, which seems to just accept that if you want people to work hard or take risks or whatever, pay them a lot of money to do it. There's a whole literature of psychology that says that actually when people are doing something that involves themselves rather than just digging a hole or doing something manual, paying them extra money actually undermines motivation. But apart from that, previous generations, I think, would have understood that someone like Stephen Hester, who's the CEO of the Royal Bank of Scotland, has a variety of reasons for why he might want to do a good job there, including patriotism, helping his country out, fairness, the challenge, the satisfaction of doing a good job. No, we are now living in a world where we think this is all about money, and it permeates everything. Let me just give you one of my favourite examples of this. This was a small booklet produced by money from the Westminster government on advice for parents with difficult children. And one of the one of the suggestions given was to reward good behaviour by giving monetary rewards. And they gave the example of being nice to your brother, 3 pence, right? Flushing the toilet, 2 pence, right? So if you're an unruly kid that has quite a lot of money that week, don't bother flushing the toilet, right? Now here are good people who care about kids, who are now, their minds have been so taken over by the idea of monetary reward. That's what they're suggesting. That's where we have got to on this. We believe that people do things either because they're rewarded externally or praised or given ticks or whatever, rather than they do it for the intrinsic satisfaction of the thing or because it's the right thing to do. It's the right social, responsible thing to flush the toilet. You don't have to be rewarded for it or praised for it. It's the right thing to do. And once we lose sight of that, then you get a loss of standards. And that is what's happening in our life. We have a huge loss of public standards. The Guardian headline a few days ago was "Power, Corruption and Lies" about the Levinson inquiry. And I think, you know, a society that becomes dominated as much as we have by money is going to have a problem with standards in public life. That's where we are with a lot of this. Now, where are we getting these ideas from? This is a scary bit. We're getting them from everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Obviously, we're getting them from the media and advertising. You know, the average Briton watches television for 4 hours a day. In Scotland, it's actually 5 hours. You're talking about exposure to 40 or 50 television adverts, let alone the billboards and other things. So, and of course, adverts are not selling you a product. They're selling you a dream. They're trying to make you dissatisfied with the status quo so that you'll go out and buy things. So, you know, we've got huge exposure to advertising, particularly children, right? There's a lot of targeting of children going on in advertising. We've also got it in politics, though, and I'm not just talking about the great goal of economic growth, but also our whole way that politics now is conducted is not about an idea for the society. I'm not being overly idealistic here, but there used to be much more of a party programme that was then put to the people for what would be good for Britain. Now it's consumer politics in many ways. It's focus groups. It's what can we do for you and your aspirational family. That's actually what politics now looks like. It's much less about us, it's much more about you. If we look at the big charities, actually, and the big charities themselves are beginning to realise this, and Tim Kasser, the psychologist I mentioned to you, is working with them in the UK on this, that they actually haven't been doing anything to challenge those values. They're actually using them for their good causes. If you've ever been to a big charity dinner, you will see what I'm talking about, because it's footballers' wives' culture writ large, right? But I gave money not that long ago to a child well-being campaign for kids in India, and I was plagued by a series of emails from the organisation doing it, where the strapline was, "Carol, we think you're special." In other words, narcissistic individualism being used for a good cause, basically. But you can see what I mean, that they're beginning to see they're not challenging the values that are a big part of the problem we've got. They're using them for their marketing and sponsorship, right? If we look at the trade unions, I don't think the trade unions in Britain have ever particularly put forward anything than quite a materialistic agenda, and that's unlike some of the European trade unions. The poverty industry as well, much as though I think they do a good job, I think that they focus far too much on the monetary problem rather than the spiritual problem, the way that people feel. Actually, that gives, and the inequality, which gives a completely different character to the debate. The idea that what we're going to do is bring everyone up to the top level is ridiculous. We're using far too many resources already. That is not a feasible option. This is about inequality. I'm not saying that there's not poverty, there is poverty, but I think it has to be set within a much bigger and better argument about inequality. So I think we have an enormous problem here. I am personally not despondent, however, because it doesn't take much to persuade people of this argument, because they're already feeling it. I did a series of things with factory workers and office workers at one point, and I put up the mental health problems, you know, the rise in depression over the last 30 or 40 years, and I said to people, why do you think that's the case? And at each table after their discussion, they all said something along the lines of, because you never have enough, you're never good enough, and you never get there. People understand this. The problem is that there is no leadership for it. You're not getting it from the politicians. You're not getting it particularly from many of the organisations. I think as citizens, we have to start becoming much more aware of this. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for people working with communities to be doing something about this. We've got to get people realising that what is driving their lives at the moment, which is very much materialistic, is not what is ultimately good for them and their families. In fact, it's the opposite in many ways. I think a major challenge for people, getting people involved in communities at all, is television. And that was the viewpoint of Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone. I remember seeing him interviewed, and he said, what's the one thing that could help build social capital? And he said, get people to turn off the television. Television is a major barrier to community involvement and people being involved in their lives. And it's one of the main reasons why people feel apathetic a lot of the time, because there's a lot of good research that says the more television you watch, the more you feel nothing in many ways, because it demands nothing of you. Doing just about anything else would at least give you some sense that you're active, you're involved, you're learning, you're doing something, you're changing, you're developing. So I don't really have time to talk about mindset. We have a lot on our website that is about mindset. I think mindset is a great antidote in many ways to this notion that we now have in our society that there's a small elite group of people who are particularly special and talented, that they need to get paid all that money, when in fact the reality is that everyone has got a huge amount of potential, and that we realise that potential through hard work, effort, and good teaching. People can be so much more than they are at the moment. And I'm not saying that from the point of view of some kind of great aspirational culture and they can all go and become entrepreneurs or whatever. We need people to become much better versions of themselves for their communities and for the collective good, not just for the good of them as individuals. Thank you very much.